This is the best budget pressure washer hose reel on the market, but mounting it to the wall can be a little challenging because of the size of the mounting bracket. So if you want to ensure that this thing is securely mounted to the wall on 2 studs without any anchors, make sure to follow the steps in this video to ensure that your pressure washer hose reel isn't going anywhere.
The first thing we need to do before doing anything with the wall is testing the pressure washer when it first arrives. We want to ensure the system is 100% leak-free prior to mounting it to the wall. One of the key elements that will help us achieve this is a high-quality thread tape.
And when it comes to taping up our threads, we always want to tape in the direction that our male threads will turn into our female threads. What I found useful is starting from the back. That way you have something to hold on to and then working your way forward. However, we're not going to go all the way to the end because the first couple of threads are slightly different in that they're slightly tapered, and this is just to help the fitting get started, so we don't want to interfere with that connection. And because this stainless steel tape is a little bit thicker than your normal tape, we don't need as much of it. So maybe like 2 or 3 passes is more than enough here. And having something like that is going to be good enough for our application. And here you can see the tail of our tape. And as we start to turn the fitting, you can see that it's actually going in the same direction as we're turning. This way it doesn't come undone, and it's going to ensure that we have a leak-free seal. And of course, we're going to want to snug it down. And next, I'm going to apply the quick connect fitting, and it's also going to allow me to have some modularity with the system in case I want to put on a wall-mounted pressure washer in the future. And we'll tighten this one down too.
Another thing to take note of is that this style of hose reel is designed for a 3/8 inch hose. So if you plan on using it with a 1/4 inch hose, as I am, you will need an additional adapter threaded onto the included 90-degree elbow on the swivel end.
In addition to that, I wouldn't use any quick connects here, because the thing about the quick connects is that it's going to add additional bulk. The loop that's going to be imposed on the hose when it comes through here to connect is more than likely going to stick out beyond the diameter of the hose reel, and that can interfere with the wall once you have it mounted up. So having everything screwed in without those quick connects is going to reduce how much it pokes out. And when it comes to this 90-degree elbow, we don't want its opening to be in parallel with the hose reel. We want it kind of slightly off to the side, either coming this way or this way in accordance with this hole, to minimize the bend and kink that we're going to induce on our pressure washer hose. So here we're just going to have to turn it a little bit, and so slightly off angle like that is perfect. And the rest of this connection is pretty standard. This is just going to be our 3/8, which is what we have running all the way through here, to an M2214 connection, which I'm wrapping up right now. And this is what our pressure washer hose is going to connect directly to. Most of the time it's going to be an M2214. The 14 refers to the diameter of this opening. But in the case of our Portland pressure washer, the connection on that actual pressure washer to the hose is an M2215. The other thing that comes included with our kit is the whip hose. And this is something that I highly recommend that you measure out the length that you need before committing to a size. Because in this case, longer isn't always better, because this is a pretty rigid hose. And in my case, the 6-foot hose that comes in some of these kits would have been way too long. 4 foot is really ideal for my situation. And if I wanted to wall mount it because of the proximity of all the parts, 2 feet would actually be better. So make sure to measure out how long of a whip hose you actually need. You'll also notice that your whip hose has one fixed end and one swiveling end. Now, typically your whip hose is where your quick connect fittings will go. And depending on your setup, this specific kit may have the correct quick connects that you need. But in my case, since I want really clean lines running to and from the pressure washer hose reel, and in this case, with the whip hose, the pressure washer itself, I'm actually going to put in a few 90-degree fittings. So these aren't necessarily included with the kit because this is something that I wanted specific for my setup, but the quick connects are going to go onto the 90-degree fittings that we have here. And for my particular setup, I'm making sure that the swivel end is going to go on the pressure washer hose reel side, and the fixed end, which is the same 90-degree fitting with the quick connect, is going to go on the hose reel side. For this purpose, because the fittings are going to be the same, it doesn't really matter because you can always invert it if you get it mixed up once we have everything hooked up. Now for our test run, I'm not going to put on any thread tape here because any fitting with an O-ring shouldn't leak because the O-ring prevents the leak. However, I will put on some spray lubricant here, and this is just going to help lubricate that O-ring when we first put it in. And when we finally decide to tighten everything down at the end, it's going to make removing this a lot easier. And here you can already begin to see that we have the kink from the hose that I was mentioning earlier. It's slightly wider than the diameter of our hose reel, but since it's slightly canted off to the side, it partially offset that. So I'm not going to sink it down for the test run. I just want to make sure that nothing leaks during this test run. And then once we confirm that there's no leaks, I'm going to remove this and then mount this to the wall. And then once this is up, I'll connect the hose.
For the test run, I would highly recommend going through a normal use scenario, such as washing a car or two in its entirety. And if it's leak free, we can start working on the wall. For our wall mount, we'll need a 2x6, and the length will need to be at least 1 inch more than the stud's distance from one another, usually 16 inches or 8 inches off a corner. So identify your studs first, then grab your wood. If you're lucky like me, you might find the piece you need in the scrap pile for half the price. Then have the store cut it to the size you need. And once you have that, figure out how high you want your reel to be and ensure it's level before tracing out where the studs will run along the mount.
So now that we have the center line of the stud, we just have to mark where we want to place our screws, and we want to place them an equal distance apart, close to an inch at least apart, with a good amount of space here. For this one, we're going to have about a 1/4 inch of space at each end, and we're going to place in 5 screws about 1 inch apart from each other. Although this might seem like a lot, this is just going to ensure that if we want to go up to a longer hose or to a 3/8 inch hose in the future, this mount is not going to go anywhere. Now, since I don't have a drill press, this vise will have to do as my second set of hands, and I'm just gonna have to try to drill this as straight as possible. Now, the reason why I'm stopping halfway, pulling out and blowing out the dust is one, it's just gonna make drilling the hole a lot easier, and it's gonna allow the drill bit to cool down. When it comes to drilling, heat is going to be the enemy of your drill bit. It's gonna slow things down, it's going to wear out your bit a whole lot faster, and you can kind of feel when your drill bit gets stuck. So if you have a higher quality set of bits, you might not need to stop halfway through as I did. But since I'm using the cheaper set from Harbor Freight, I am gonna have to go with the method of stopping about halfway, blowing out the dust, allowing it to cool for a second, and then re-engaging. And the drill bit that we're using here is a 7/64 bit, which is on the smaller side of what you would typically use to pre-drill a hole for a number 10 screw, which is what we're going to use to secure our mount to the wall studs. And it really depends on how hard of a wood you're using for your mount, because you could pre-drill as small as 7/64 all the way up to 13/64. It really depends on how hard of a wood that you're working with. If you're unsure, you could always take a piece of scrap and pre-drill from the smallest size to the largest size and see what's going to provide you with the best holding force at the smallest size without making that cracking sound as you drill in your screw. So this next part is very important because we are about to line up where our hose reel is going to line up in relation to the back side of our mount. So this portion of the board is actually going to be facing the wall. And we're just lucky enough that our mount, and most of them of this design, have the mounting holes equidistant from each other. So we can line up the hose reel on the back side and have a good idea of where it's going to sit on the front side. But at least this way we can line up the center of these holes so we can drill in with our Forstner bit to properly place in our T-nuts. One of the things that I want to make sure before I do that is make sure that the end of our mount doesn't interfere with a wrench if you need to get it in. So right here is kind of good. There's a little bit of space there, and that should be okay. However, if you're going with a 16 long inch board and just wherever you want to place the reel, hopefully at least you can get a socket on there if this ever leaks and you need to service it. The other thing that you want to make sure is that you have enough space for your screws once they go in. And although these screws will sit flush and won't necessarily interfere with the mounting plate on the board, we don't want these holes too close to each other in order to maintain as much structural integrity with our mount as possible. And just to make sure that everything is kind of leveled up, I'm going to take our speed square here, line it up on the wood, and then just press our hose reel. And that should be good enough. And then double check everything. And get a wrench on there. These screws are not too close to our mounting hole and won't interfere with the mount itself. And now that I like the placement of our mount, I'm just going to mark with a nail, or you could do this with a punch, the center of each hole so that we know where we can line up our Forstner bit. And since we are just using a T-nut, we don't want to go all the way through or even all that deep. We want as much structural support from the wood as the bolt on the other side is pulling this.
Unlike a spade bit or twist bit, the Forstner bit is designed to create a very clean hole as well as a flat bottom if you don't plan to go all the way through, as we will here, ensuring our T-nut is properly seated. And due to its design, it's less likely to walk off if you're doing this by hand.
And this is why, preferably you would do this with a drill press in order to get this as straight as possible. However, all I have is a vise, but it's a pretty good vise. Measure it up. And if you need a little more, that's the nice thing about this, is that you can go more as you need it. The entire diameter is going to seat, and that's fine. Same thing, it's going to seat all the way through and through, no issues. Time to flip it. Much better. So there it is. All of the holes cut by that Forstner bit fit this T-nut perfectly, since this is a 22.2 millimeter diameter and we use a 7/8 Forstner bit. The great thing about the Forstner bit for these T-nuts is that the center is already marked out for us. So let's see if that lines up, and yeah, that should do the trick. And that's definitely more than enough. We should be able to pull these all in with the bolt as well. So that all looks pretty good. Now we can drop in our bolts for our test fit. And thankfully everything lined up well, so we can begin tightening all of these down. And you do kind of want to walk these in one by one, that way it doesn't get lopsided too much. And thankfully you can see that the T-nuts are fully seated into their holes and everything is lined up nice and tight. Although it might seem like these two holes here at the end are a little bit close, even if you compare the head, there's still a little bit of clearance there. And since this is the back side that's going to be mounted up to the wall, when you compare the smaller screw end, we have more than enough space here. We even have enough space to service our hose reel without the board getting in the way. Another thing to consider is applying some epoxy to the T-nuts so they don't back out. All we have to do is carefully push out the T-nuts, mix up the epoxy, apply it to the mating surface, and place back in the T-nuts in alignment with their prongs. And if you plan on using the same exact epoxy that I'm gonna leave linked down in the description, along with everything else that we use in this video, this particular epoxy sets in 5 minutes, cures in an hour, and can load weight in 24 hours. But just to be safe, I'm gonna let this sit overnight, and then it's time for paint.
And when it comes to the epoxy, less is more here. We only want it applied where the flat side and prongs of the T-nut will engage. We don't want to risk any of this getting on the threads. Just due to the nature of it being compressed, some of it will ooze out as you see here. So we want to minimize this as much as possible. This next part is where you'll start to see my OCD come out, because I used wood filler to cover up the holes. However, if this doesn't bother you, you can totally skip this step. But if you're curious, I used JB Quickwood and some spare bolts to protect the threads. Just make sure to remove them before the filler gets hard and pack it in. Once it cures, sand it down, and we can also lightly sand the entire piece while we're here, so the paint has something to hang on to. Just wipe it down with some alcohol first to get rid of the dust, and now we're ready for paint. Here I went with a microfiber roller to apply 2 coats to each side. From what I found, foam rollers provide a smoother finish compared to microfiber. Although it will be very minimal, I figured having some texture would help hold the mount and reel in place, at least while it's getting secured onto the studs and mount respectively. If you want, feel free to use a primer. I just didn't have any on hand in this case. Even without a primer, 2 coats is more than enough here. Fortunately, I happen to have extra paint from when the garage was painted, but you can paint this any color you want. And I do recommend that you paint the mount to protect the wood, just in case there is a leak. Even if you have treated wood, having this extra layer of protection will only enhance its durability. The only trouble might be getting full coverage. As you can see, I used those spare bolts again along with the vise to give the board some lift to help the roller get around the edges. To get the areas the roller can't reach, I used a combination of makeup sponges and cotton swabs with an additional pass with the roller to even it out. Then after that last coat cures, it's finally time for it to go up. Start by bringing it back up to your desired height and ensure it's level before drilling through the screw holes on the mount to mark the wall. Then with the mount out of the way, finish pre-drilling each hole, confirming they're on the studs. To hold the mount in position, I used nails at the corners until it was screwed in. For the first few screws, drive them in a little slower while keeping an eye on your level. As you can see, as the initial slack is taken up, the board will move. You'll also want to secure the screws in an alternating pattern to reduce the likelihood of the board shifting. Another thing here is that I didn't drive the screws in flush with the board at this point because I didn't want to risk driving it in further than intended. The screws that I went with here are the 3 1/8 inch number 10 GRK multi-purpose screws. These are a very high quality screw that feature a T25 head, and after accounting for the 1.5 inch of the mount and the 1/2 inch of the drywall, each screw should drive in about 1 inch and 1/8 to the respective stud. In addition to providing all the holding force we'll need, this should be a very safe penetrating distance into the studs, even if there's wiring or piping running through them. Once all the screws are in, we can finish them by hand, and I found that L wrenches worked best here. However, this is another step, as well as the next one where my OCD got the best of me. So if you can live with some of them not being flush, or if you're more skilled with an impact, feel free to skip this step. As well as the part where I paint the screws with a Q-tip. And because I knew I would do this, I only applied 1 coat of paint to this side earlier. Personally, I feel 2 coats looks best. Anything more than that begins to look excessively layered on. And once that cures, we can bolt on our hose reel. But don't forget the lock washer and washer in this order to prevent the bolts from backing out. Start by threading them in by hand, then walk in the bolts in an alternating pattern so it lays down evenly before locking it into place. Now we can finish assembling the hose reel. First up is the handle that is held in by 3 of the included 10mm nuts, number 2 screws, and washers. Next is our hose that gets another spray of the silicone lube followed by the whip hose. Hand tight should be more than enough here. Once you confirm that the loop and whip hose have enough clearance, fix the hose in place with the flexible buckle. Of the 3 threads sticking out, one should be longer than the others. This is the one the buckle fixes onto with the last 10mm nut. Just hold down the other side with another 10mm so it doesn't slip on you. Finally, all that's left to do is roll up your hose, connect the pressure washer, and enjoy a more convenient experience when washing your car. And if you want to see the best upgrades for your pressure washer or another way to upgrade your garage, check out these videos, and I'll see you in that one.